welcome everybody once again to another edition of What You Believe. I'm Devin Croner. I'm your host, and I'm glad to have you with us today. We have an incredible guest, and I do not want to waste any time that I can give to having her share her thoughts, her perspectives, her experiences with us. So I'm going to go ahead and bring her in right now. And there she is. Hello.
Hi.
Welcome, welcome, welcome. Thank you so
Thank
much
you.
for taking the time to join me today. I really appreciate it. You can
Sure.
hear me
And I'm
okay?
sorry, I can hear you great. I just saw your text message. My name is Divya.
Divya. Okay, well, I
Yes.
was I was not going to say it like that, so I'm glad. We've been communicating via text, not in person so far. So, Divya, welcome and thank you again. What I want to do is just have you start off by telling us a little bit about you, who you are, what you do. You have a lot of diversity in your life and your experiences, so share a little bit of that with us.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to do this. I am, I'm in special education. Um, I was a teacher for about 8 years. I taught in Connecticut and in New York City, in the Bronx specifically.
Wow.
And I have been so lucky to work with so many diverse students, diversity in terms of background and ability. And about 3 years ago, I decided to leave the classroom, and I'm in a full-time PhD program at Penn State. So I live in the middle of Pennsylvania now, which is a big change. So yeah, that's pretty much kind of the path that I've been on. I specifically research math instruction for students with learning disabilities.
Very cool. So talk about the change, the cultural change from the Bronx to Pennsylvania a little bit as we get in before we get into the educational side of things.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a culture shock, to say the least. I'm actually from the New York City area. I was born in India, but when I was about 2 years old, my family and I moved to the United States, and we lived in the Bronx. And then I grew up for the most part in Westchester, which is just north of Manhattan. So I'm from the New York City area. So moving out here was definitely a big change. It's much quieter. There are a lot more trees, which I find a little unnerving. I'm not used to all the nature. Yeah, it's just quiet. I do miss the diversity that I would see in New York. Just walking around in New York City or even in Westchester, you would see a lot of different kinds of people,
Right.
which I wish I saw more of that here.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's been a great experience so far. I'm usually very busy with work, so I don't have too much time to do other things. But I've made some great friends, and it's definitely been a learning experience being out here.
Absolutely. Now I have to ask about the India part. Have you ever been back to India?
I have, yeah. I've gone back several times.
Okay.
My family and I used to go back every few years when I was a kid. Most of my extended family lives there.
Mhm.
So yeah, we used to go back pretty often. Unfortunately, I'm trying to think now. I don't think I've been back for about 6 years.
Okay.
This is probably the longest I've gone without going back.
Wow. And
I
what
love it
part of
here.
India were you from?
So my parents are actually from two different parts of India.
Okay.
My mother grew up in Delhi,
Mhm.
which is very similar to New York City.
Mhm.
My dad is actually from Bangalore, which is all the way in the south.
Okay.
So my parents they're both Indian, but they're extremely different in terms of
Mhm.
their backgrounds, their religions, and just the specific family cultures that they grew up in.
Yeah.
So kind of straddling different cultures has been something that I think I've been doing my whole life.
Absolutely. Yeah. My wife, shortly after we got married, spent about 6 months working in Delhi, and I had a chance to go over for a couple of weeks, and just a completely different place, but so neat. The temples, and we went to a fort a couple hours outside of Delhi, and just the food, the street food. Oh my goodness.
It's so good.
Uh, My favorite thing, this is totally third or first world ish of me, but my favorite thing was they had like massage envy type places where you could get a massage, but it was less than $20 American for an hour massage. And I was just like, here, just take all my money. I'm just spending the whole day getting a massage. It was
Yeah.
fantastic. But awesome. So you have done special education. What exactly is special education for those who may not know or understand, and how did you get into that?
So special education is very near and dear to my heart. I truly love the field that I'm in. Special education is about providing students of all abilities with high quality learning experiences and instruction,
Mhm.
and really working to improve outcomes for any child, regardless of their ability or background. I always say special education is just about doing things in classrooms and in schools that work for all kids.
Mhm.
So I feel very privileged to work in this field. I actually kind of got into it accidentally. I was in medical school and was not liking it. And so I left after my first year, and it was kind of like, what am I going to do? I need a job. So
Mhm.
I got a job teaching math and science because that's what I knew. That was my background. And I happened to teach for a private tutoring company, who also were running an alternative school, an alternative therapeutic day school for adolescents. And so that's when I discovered the world of special ed. I actually didn't really know anything about it beforehand. And I just love the complexity of the work. And I love that it's really focused on the individual.
Mhm.
It's really about the learner, not about the content, and certainly not about the teacher.
Hmm. So it's going to be very individualized based on the actual student that you are working with, correct?
Yes.
So, because like I remember growing up 20-ish years ago, we had an alternative school in our high school. And those of us that weren't in it didn't really know a whole lot about it other than it was a separate building. And that's where all the, I mean, I'm not trying to be mean or anything, but the way the slow people went there, the bad people went there, the messed up people went there, and then the people who just, were born with birth defects, disabilities, learning problems, things like that. They all went there, and there were like two teachers in our alternative school, and I don't know what it was like. I don't, I never had a chance to really interact with them and find out their experiences, but I remember thinking, gosh, what can that possibly be like for them? So obviously you've been in it not for 20 years, but how has special education kind of evolved and developed over recent history?
Yeah, the evolution of special education is it's complicated, I think. I think outcomes, well, we know that outcomes for many students have really improved since federal legislation that kind of started special ed came onto the scene in, I believe, 1972 or 74. And I really was attracted to special ed because I think of education as a civil rights issue. And I just happened to fall in love with working with students who have special needs. But I would say it's still evolving. I actually, when you were describing your experience, I was thinking about when I was a student. I went to school in the 80s, 90s. I don't remember ever even hearing about special ed. And
Hmm.
I went to many schools when I was a kid. My family moved around a lot. So I was exposed to a lot of different schools, and I can't ever remember even hearing about special ed.
Hmm.
So I think it's definitely come a long way in the sense of, I think there's a lot more visibility for it.
Hmm.
And there have been great strides in terms of inclusion and inclusivity for students of different abilities. But I think there's still a lot of work to be done um, in terms of the improving experiences for students in classrooms, and also just in terms of how, as a society, we look at students who have special needs.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think that one of the things that immediately comes to mind for me One of my good friends growing up in school, he had, I'm trying to remember, the hydrocephalus, I believe it was hydrocephalus, and a brilliant kid, but just had a little trouble communicating, had a little bit of trouble moving, things like that. And so he would spend some time in the alternative school, but then he spent some time in the regular classes as well. And about the only experience I have with alternative education, special education, was through him. And I remember his mom, because I would go over to his house, we were friends, talking about how their goal was for him to be reintegrated with the normal kids. And that was her words, not mine. Her words, to be reintegrated with the normal kids. That he was getting the extra help he needed so that he could be reintegrated with the normal kids. Is that kind of how it's looked at still, or is that kind of perception evolving some as well?
Yeah, that's really interesting. That reminds me of something that I read in a research article when I first started my doc program, and this was, a scientific paper.
Hmm.
And one of the first sentences was that as special education professionals, our goal is to get our students not to need us anymore. And so I think in that sense, it is true. The goal of special education is always to um, yeah, get students to integrate with their typically developing peers.
Hmm.
And that's going to look different, for different students. And I think that's what makes special education so interesting for me, is that you're always trying to balance what your goals are for that student, which is always to be included with their typically developing peers, but
Hmm.
also giving them the supports that they need, which can look different than the
Hmm.
supports you would give a typically developing student.
Hmm.
So that's I think that's what makes my work challenging, but also really interesting.
Hmm. So, in a typical school day, week, year, how many students are you responsible for working with at one time generally?
Yeah, that can vary widely depending on the setting
Hmm.
that you, or I should say, the students are in. So there's a wide range of settings in special education, going from least restrictive, where um, there a student is spending their entire school day with typically developing peers.
Hmm.
On the other hand, and you can have students who are in more restrictive settings. So that can be what we call a self-contained classroom in a community school. That would be kind of, I think, what you were describing when you were a kid, where you had that separate room
Hmm.
in your school, but those kids were spending their whole day there. You
Hmm.
can also have, going even further on towards that end of the spectrum, the kind of school that I mentioned I worked at initially, which was a separate school.
Hmm.
So that school was only for students who had that specific disability. So there's such a wide range of variability.
Hmm.
And so as a teacher, you could be spending your day. So a lot of what I used to do was what we call co-teaching. So I
Hmm.
would be a special education teacher in a classroom with a general education or content teacher. And we would work together with the same class throughout the day. I've also worked in self-contained settings where I was a teacher for the kids in that separate room in a community school. So I only worked with my students in my classroom. And then going even further to a separate school where obviously I'm just working with the students who go to that school, and the work we did was very individualized. Sometimes it was one-on-one.
Hmm. And how, I mean, I know schools in general tend to be underfunded anyway. Resources are scarce, staffing is an issue, and that's in the ideal setting. So now you're taking a segment of students who have special needs. And again, special needs can be a lot of different things, but you're putting them in a separate environment. And then basically each student needs an individualized plan. You can't just teach one class to everybody in this kind of setting. How do you structure that? How do you manage that?
It's a lot. And I think that is, I know for myself when I was a teacher, and I know my teacher friends, that kind of encompasses the challenges we face every day. Really dealing with just scarcity of, everything, which is obviously how the world works. But I think when you are talking about students or kids in schools, that can be extra challenging. And sometimes it's frustrating. And, it's special education is really built on systems in schools, and even in society in terms of how we think about, education.
Mhm.
So you need buy-in from everyone. And if you're going to help a student who has a special need, if you're going to help them make progress and reach certain goals, um, they need to be supported by multiple professionals, which can be challenging. So yeah, it's I think funding issues definitely exacerbate things, but I think even in schools where funding is not an issue,
Mhm.
um, just integrating services and again getting buy-in from everyone
Mhm.
is really a daily challenge.
So I want to come back to that idea of the buy-in and the participation, but stay on the structure for a moment. You said the structure is very, very important. Talk a little bit more about that. What does that mean? What does that structure look like in a special education school or classroom or setting?
So when a student has a special need, depending on the severity of that disability, they're going to need support from different professionals, special ed teachers, occupational therapists, speech therapists, physical therapists, behaviorists. There's a long list of professionals who work with students who have special needs. Um, and again, I think my experience was that the availability of those services really depended on the school district that you're in. I worked in school districts where these were Title I schools, so students were coming from lower income backgrounds, and we didn't have those related service providers, even though students were federally mandated to get them. And then I worked in schools where any service that a child needed, they could get. So I think integrating all those services is kind of the system that I was talking about there.
Do you notice in your experience, you said that you've been in schools where there just weren't the resources, and then there are schools where they could get whatever they needed. Do you see a major differentiation being location, ethnicity, that sort of thing? How does that play into, for lack of a better term, the opportunities that are going to be available to these students?
Definitely. So in America, we fund schools with taxes, primarily property taxes. And most funding for schools, I think it's about 90%, comes from state and local agencies, government agencies. So that's really going to affect the quality, or rather the funding that schools can get in specific communities. And so that's going to lead to a lot of inequity. And so that would be, if I had my wish for an ideal world, that would be the first thing that we would change. I think that would really close the gaps that we see in education. So it can be really challenging. I'm thinking of, when I taught in the Bronx, I was teaching in Title I schools, and literally 15 miles away were some of the most affluent towns and neighborhoods in the country.
Mhm.
It's literally a couple of exits on the highway,
Yeah.
which that can be, when you're when you're aware of that, it just kind of gives you a new perspective, on the work that you're doing for students.
hmm So how would you fix that? Again, schools are funded through property taxes. Should it be everything just goes into one big kitty and is doled out evenly? Do we need to look at restructuring how the funding is done entirely? What, from an educator perspective, what is your thought on how that could be done differently to help with that inequality and inequity?
Yeah, I mean, I'm an educator. I'm not a policy person. But I think from my perspective, yeah, kind of really restructuring how we fund schools and education would be a place to start. And I think from the little that I know about how other countries are handling education, I think there are some really important lessons we can learn from them. Societies that are diverse in terms of ethnicity, race, background, and they're able to provide more students with more equitable opportunities. Um, no society is ever going to be completely equitable and fair for every child, unfortunately. But I think it's really about closing those gaps as much as we can, and really about, everyone in society buying into the idea that if you're a child, it doesn't matter what zip code you were born in, it doesn't matter what abilities you have, you should be given a high quality education.
Mhm. Mhm. Absolutely. So going back to the idea of the partnerships and the buy-in aspect, um, first of all, let me ask you, how important is it to have that buy-in and work through the home environment first of all, and what happens if that's not there, or maybe there's a lack of understanding on the part of the parent of what they need, or you're in a situation where maybe there are parents who are drug addicts or not around a lot, those sorts of situations, how does that change the dynamic as well?
Yeah, I mean, a student's home life is a huge component of how much progress they're going to make.
Mm,
And I've been really lucky to work with some students whose parents and families were really their biggest advocates. And that was amazing to see. And those students, I actually have a Zoom meeting with another one of those students later today who graduated. And he's in college now. And his mother is an example of someone who just was such an incredible advocate for him. And really, I think those parents, from what I saw, really were very brutally honest about where their child was and where they can go,
mm,
and really relied on expertise of special education teachers and school professionals. Um, and so I think that's a huge part of helping students make progress. On the other hand, I have worked with a lot of students whose home lives were very, very chaotic and definitely less than ideal, and that was a challenge, because at the end of the day, as a special education teacher, I have the student for sometimes maybe even only 40 minutes a day. When you get to high school, where students are changing classes, and that's it's what can you do in 40 minutes a day? Sometimes that can be really challenging. So yeah, definitely having parents who are just very honest about what they want for their child,
mhm,
um, and really, being consistent about doing reinforcing behaviors at home is another really important thing. So again, having that buy-in from families and parents is, I think, really important for students to make progress.
mm. What is it like, if you've experienced this, having to have the conversation with a parent that maybe they don't realize that their child has a learning disability, a special need, because it's not a physical, maybe it's not a physical problem, but dyslexia, whatever it might be, and they're just like, there's something wrong and I don't know what it is, and you kind of have to talk to them about, here's the issue, and what is that like, and how do they get defensive, do they get angry, is there relief because now there's an answer to a question? What is that part like?
Yeah, in special education, we have what's called a referral process, which starts with a teacher identifying a struggle that a student is having,
Mhm,
and then integrating services with the school and the district, and getting consent from the parents to have the student assessed. So that's a whole big process in special
mhm,
education, and I think I've seen every reaction that you just described. And I'm not a parent yet, so as much as I have really loved many of my students, I can't know what it's like to have a child. So I've always tried to look at it from that perspective when I'm kind of having this conversation with a parent. And I really try to frame everything when I'm talking to parents, when I'm talking to students, even my colleagues, within this framework of, we want the student to be successful and we want them to make progress. So maybe we have to do things a little differently. Maybe your student needs a little bit more support than a student who doesn't have a disability. but it's really about having the student experience success. So I've always tried to frame it, within that for the parents. And at the end of the day, I mean, that's what a parent would want for their child, is to be successful in school. So I've always tried to stick with that selling point.
Mhm. Now, you talked a little bit ago about the idea of being honest about where the student is and the capabilities from the family standpoint, the parent standpoint. What, how do you help set those expectations for the parents, for the students, to create? Here's what success is, because again, it can look very, very different depending on what the issue is, depending on when they're able to be assessed. Maybe if something was missed for years and years, it's going to be way different now that they're already a teenager than if it had been identified and they were in, first grade. So what is that like as far as determining what is success going to look like, and how do we get there?
I think that's really an area where professionalism and training, as a special education teacher, or if you are a related service provider as well, but really for a special education teacher, this is where our training comes into play. Special education is a social science, and if you are lucky to receive your special education teacher training in a program that really stresses sort of the scientific side of special education, then you're getting training in how to observe students, collect data on either academic or behavioral things, and presenting that data to parents and even to your colleagues. And so really going from a place of trying to be as objective as possible about specific behaviors in a student, not the student themselves.
Right.
So I think that was.
Sorry, I
No,
thought
that's okay. Yeah, so that's, I think, I think really emphasizing that for special education teachers, that's really where that comes into play.
Mm-hmm. Is that difficult sometimes, because you can have the same issue, whatever it is? Again, dyslexia is the one that just comes to mind for me. You can have 10 students that have dyslexia, but how you work with them and their capabilities and all that can be incredibly different. So is it hard for you as the special education educator and professional to kind of have a blank slate with each person, and sometimes not get frustrated because person number 4 isn't doing as well as person number 1 was? Does that make sense, what I'm asking?
Absolutely, yeah. And that can be, I think that's what makes being a special education teacher exciting and challenging. But yeah, that's what we do. Now that I'm in the research side of things, I've learned that from the research side, we know about a lot of things that do work with students who have disabilities. But there is a disconnect between what we know on the researcher side and how that's being received in the practitioner community. And that was one of the reasons why I was attracted to doing a PhD, is kind of, helping to bridge that gap. But yeah, that's the work of a special education teacher, is every day. You start with, hopefully you've received training in, what specific instructional things to do with a student who is presenting with something that looks like dyslexia, and trying things, keeping data, keeping records, and just, I think special education is really about those little things that we do every day. That's what I used to try to do as a teacher, was at the end of the day when the kids would go home, looking at the data that I collected that day, and then using that to make decisions for the next day, and just doing that every day. And again, we have evidence that certain things that teachers can do can improve outcomes for students.
Mm-hmm. So it's not about having a concrete plan and saying, okay, here's your issue, here are steps A through Z, and this is exactly what we're going to do. There has to be some flexibility. You might get, into it and find out this isn't working the way we thought, and have to completely scrap that and do something else.
Absolutely. And I think that's what makes special education so distinct from general education in general, is that in special education, that's what we really emphasize, is that we know that we have certain plans that we can try.
Mhm.
But yeah, as you said, we're going to try plan A. And if after a certain time period we see that that's not working, then we can go to another plan. But really keeping in mind that specific student's needs and strengths.
Absolutely. Is there ever a level of frustration that you can reach of where it just seems like nothing you're doing is working and you just want to give up in this kind of role?
I think, yes, I think I know I've experienced that. I think most of my teacher friends have experienced that. And again, it's a day to day sort of thing. I found for me, whenever I was reaching that level as the teacher, that was a signal for me to step back and reassess the goals for that student.
Mhm.
So, and that's a huge part of what a special education teacher does, is really thinking about what is the student's goal right now. So the last school I taught at happened to be a high school. And so I felt like I was doing that on a constant basis, shifting my goals from maybe, graduating high school with a regular diploma to having a student come into our classroom and feel like he wanted to be there. So just really, again, paying attention to what the student needs, and what their strengths are. I think that's another thing that I love about special education is, we're not focused on the deficiencies that a student has. We're also just as focused on the things that the student is great at.
And that's so key because again, you can, as a pastor, sometimes you work with people in situations and counseling situations, and you reach this place like, okay, I've tried everything, I don't know what to do, but yet they're still hurting, and so you can't just stop. You can't just write them off because then that they're not going to get better and things are not going to change. And the same thing with the student. If you write them off as a special education teacher, there's really nowhere else for them to turn at that point. And so what you just kind of described is what you already said about shifting the target and redefining what success is. But again, you may have to constantly do that as you realize, okay, that's not going to be a success for them. We're not there. And I would imagine that there's an emotional tug of war that takes place in you because you want everybody to succeed. But if you're being real and honest about what that looks like, it's just not going to be the same for everybody, is it?
No, and as you're saying that, I'm thinking of the flip side of that, which is another big part of what a special education teacher does, is sort of moving the goalpost after students have met goals.
Mm.
Which that's always an incredible part of the job. I think is again, if you're keeping track of your students' progress, keeping good data, and you're constantly evaluating where your student is. Once you realize that they've met a goal, you can kind of check that off and move on and create a new goal for them. So that's also part of that too, which is such a gratifying experience.
Mhm. How do you, I guess, maintain? You're a very positive person. Just in talking to you here, you look like a positive person. You exude energy. How do you do that though, on a continual basis in education in general, let alone in special education? Again, when you are constantly dealing with being asked to do more with less, not having all the resources, whatever it is, how do you internally handle that?
It's hard. um, I um, I experienced burnout as a teacher primarily because of what you were describing, and I'm thinking about when I first started teaching in the Bronx. The people that I became really close with, other special education teachers, um, none of us are still in the classroom.
Mm.
We've all moved on to doing different things, still in education,
Mm.
um, but different roles, because it is hard. um, and I really used to try to focus on a balance of really focusing on the student and kind of trying to you know not not pay attention to the noise kind of in the background,
Mhm.
which is hard. But balancing that with also, my needs. At the end of the day, I'm a regular person, and I need to take care of myself. And so but that's a really hard balance, and I think that's why we see a lot of teacher burnout.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. And also the fact that we just don't pay you all the way that we should pay you all. But that's a whole other topic for
Yes.
another time. Uh, I want to talk about the students themselves a little bit. What is their perspective? What are they thinking, when they come in to a classroom, a special education classroom, a special education program, whatever it is, are they coming in excited because now they're going to have an opportunity hopefully to be successful? Are they coming in feeling like, okay, I'm a failure and I'm stupid? Because I mean, society is very cruel, and childhood is very cruel as well. So what is that like, and how do you help them, whatever level they're in, to move forward with it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'm thinking back to all my students. I think I saw all those reactions from them.
Mm,
I think a lot of the kind of reaction that they would have depended on the kind of disability that they had.
mhm,
We live in a society where certain disabilities are worse than others. So that was a factor, and I think also things like age, how much self awareness they have. Those were all factors. I definitely had some students who, were not happy about quote unquote being special ed.
mm,
So, that was a challenge. And again, I really used to try to focus on, that this is work that we're doing to help the student be successful.
mhm,
Just really focusing on daily success
mhm,
was, I think, the biggest and most powerful sort of strategy that I had. And, with students, I think, like with human beings, once they experience some success, it's such a gratifying experience and they just want more of that.
mm,
Once they can see that, doing things a little differently than how they've had to do things can
mhm,
help them meet goals and be successful, that's such a powerful experience for them.
mhm. Do you find that, for the most part, again, I know that it's going to be tiered based on the issues, but for the most part, everybody can be successful, or are there some kids that just can't? The issues are too deep or too prominent or too severe.
So special education is built on the idea, and I would say the truth, that every child can learn.
Mm,
I 100% believe that about every student I've worked with. And I think that's the buy-in that I was mentioning earlier. That's the buy-in that we need um, from everyone who works in a school, from a child's parents and their families, and from our society in terms of how we talk about education, how we talk about students who have disabilities. Unfortunately, I think we still have a long way to go in
yeah.
terms of that. And that's even saying, that's even within my field.
Mhm,
I have worked with other special education teachers who haven't necessarily had that they haven't necessarily bought into that idea, and that's really where it starts. Every single child can learn because every human can learn. That's what we do.
mhm,
So really coming into as a teacher, coming into work every day and really framing all our behaviors with students through that lens, that's what's going to lead to improvement.
Talk about the partnership aspect and the buying aspect in terms of the schools, the district, the principals, the administrators, the other teachers, those sorts of things. Because I would assume that that's key, obviously, as well, because there's the peer aspect there, but also they can help you identify students that may have issues. They can help, with the integration side of it, all that. So how important is that, but also how do you move the needle to where they see the importance of what you're doing with students as well?
Yeah, I think Again, I think I had a wide range of experiences when it comes to that. I definitely worked with colleagues and administrators who, had that buy-in that every child in the school can learn. And so they were, supportive of decisions that I used to make to kind of make that come true. And that was amazing, because at the end of the day, it really did lead to improved outcomes for students that I was working with in those schools. I have unfortunately worked in many schools, and with colleagues and administrators who didn't have that understanding, and that was a challenge. But there again, I think relying on my training, and relying on professionalism, was really the biggest asset that I had there. Relying on my training as a special ed teacher in terms of, again, collecting data, monitoring progress, and then really celebrating student successes. One of the quickest things that I learned when I started teaching was emailing a principal or a school administrator about a specific student success. It was kind of something that I randomly did one day, and it was amazing for the student, and it was also amazing for the principal. It really, I think doing things like that really help non-special ed people see that yes, all students can learn, all students can be successful. We just need to. It's our job as educators to kind of pave the way for that. And to work together with each other to do that.
How are the schools set up, or is it all different? Is it different by district to provide special education? Because again, you referred back at the beginning about how this is a federally mandated thing that these opportunities be there, but yet we know that there are a lot of things that are supposed to be available when it comes to education that are not always the case. So, I mean, in the Bronx, for instance, what does that look like? Is it just you're in the coat closet trying to teach kids as best you can? Do you have your own facilities? Do you have your own resources? Is that how it should look? You talk about that part of it some.
Yeah, again, very wide variability in terms of my experiences with that. I think so. Yes, special education is federally mandated. So from the legal side of things, I don't know that there's a lot of variability in terms of how things are supposed to be done. Whether you are, in an affluent district in California or you're in the inner city in Chicago. But I think going back to what we were talking about earlier, the funding issues and access issues are really going to change how that looks. And education is interesting now because we have charter schools, which have really changed the game a lot. I worked at a few charter schools, and even there, I saw a ton of variability. So it really looks different in terms of how schools can meet those federal mandates of providing a free and appropriate education to all students. So yeah, it's, and I'm sure you would hear this from anyone who works in education, not just special ed.
Mm. Well, and especially now when we are in still the midst of the pandemic and schools have been shut down, there's a lot of discussion about reopening and how to do that and doing that safely. What is that going to look like in your mind on the special education side of it, where you have kids that need maybe individualized attention or they need certain therapies or things like that? If we're not able to be in a classroom setting safely like we have been, what are there any thoughts about how that's going to happen?
Yeah, that has been something that was one of the first things I thought of when, when schools were shutting down. I'm not in the classroom anymore, but, talking to my teacher friends who are, or who are still in schools, that's, I think, our biggest concern. There are students who have more severe disabilities who receive schooling year round. And, so that's clearly not happening either. So it's very concerning. and it's also concerning to think about the gains that students have lost, you
Mhm.
know, by having to be at home and not being in school.
Mhm.
Um, so I think all of that is, I think, you know, we're still in the middle of this crisis, obviously.
Mhm.
Um, I think looking ahead, there are going to be so many things that we discover and we learn as we hopefully, you know, can get to the other side of this crisis,
Mhm.
whenever that is. But yeah, it's actually it's been kind of scary to think about, you know, um, how students have really been affected by this. Students who have special needs.
Right. And what about the homeschool aspect? Because again, right now, I mean, there's always been people who have homeschooled their children. I grew up with some of them. Some of them, I think, were homeschooled very well. Some of them were not homeschooled quite so well. But that aspect of it, of especially if you have a kid with special needs, again, it doesn't matter if it's a physical issue, a learning disability, whatever it might be. Because I would assume that, again, a parent always wants to see the best in their kids. My kids are perfect even if they're not perfect, so it can be harder to identify and maybe address and then get the help. So what about, are there any challenges there that you can speak to that have been addressed or are being addressed in terms of like homeschool environments?
Yeah, that's been something I have. I think that's been kind of the most surprising and concerning thing about what's been happening in the world. Um, you know, on the one hand, mm, a lot of times parents know their children best, and so they're going to. And as you said, you know, they have their child's best interest at heart. So they're going to the best of their ability, give their children, you know, a quality experience at home
Hmm.
with the resources that they have. At the same time, you know, I wouldn't discount the training that specifically special education teachers have that, you know, is unique to our profession that you're not going to have if you didn't go through that training. Um, and, you know, I also, in thinking about all this, I've also been thinking about the dynamics in students' homes, you know, where they have siblings or, you know, grandparents living at home, you know, different people living at home. It's not just that child and their mom or dad. You know, those dynamics are going to be really powerful in terms of how a child is learning at home, whether they have a special need or not.
Absolutely. Are there partnerships that were already in place for kids who were maybe being educated at home, homeschool environments, co-ops, things like that, if there are special needs that are involved? Or is that something that now we may have to look at developing a whole new system and format for, given what's currently happening in the world?
That's a great question. I actually don't know much about. I'm not aware of partnerships like that, but that's not an area that I have been familiar with when I was a teacher, and it's not an area that I research now.
Mhm.
But that would be really interesting to look into. And yeah, I think as you're saying in your question, that's going to be, you know, a new area that we're going to have to look at as a field.
A lot of
Um,
things that are going to come into existence that
yes,
haven't been.
definitely.
So,
Yeah, I think
well,
that's going to be one of them.
let's shift gears a little bit. You've moved out of the classroom, you've mentioned, into the research side of it. What are you doing? What is the cause of this? What are you hoping the outcome will be?
Yeah. So, as I said earlier, I specifically research mathematic instruction
Mhm.
for students who have learning disabilities. Um, so I look at academic interventions. So specific instructional strategies and behaviors that teachers can have in a classroom to improve academic outcomes for students with learning disabilities. I've also been really lucky to get exposed to other areas. I've done a little bit of work in teacher preparation, special education teacher preparation, which was really cool. Um, and my specific research interests are for middle and high school students
Mhm.
who tend to be pretty under researched for some reason. But I've been lucky to do some work in early mathematics, which was really interesting. Um, But yeah, I'm now entering my final year of the program, so I'm really focused on my dissertation, which so I kind of have a little bit of tunnel vision with that. But I have just, when I started this program, I just thought it was so cool that, people are trying to figure out really how to help all students,
Mm.
different ages, different ability levels, whether we're talking about academic outcomes or behavioral outcomes. It's just the world of special education research is just so vast, and it's just, there are so many little pockets that are just so fascinating.
And so what will be the next step? You graduate, you get your PhD. Are you hoping to train teachers? Are you hoping to teach like upcoming educators in university? Are you looking to continue doing more research? All of those things. What is your next step?
Yes, all of those things. I mean, we'll see how the job search goes. I'm going to be starting my job search this fall, which, with what's going on in the world, I don't know what that's going to look like. But yeah, that's my goal, is to work as a professor at a university and do both those sides, do research and do teacher preparation.
Mhm.
That's another area that I've been exposed to in my program, is teacher preparation, working with pre-service and in-service teachers. So that's definitely something that I'm going to be doing as well.
Wow. Wow. So that hopefully upcoming teachers who are getting into special education have the tools, the resources, the ability to do the things that you were talking about in the classroom environment, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Wow. Now, will you be developing, like a new system for teaching math? Is that something you're working on for students who have learning disabilities, or is that kind of a different subsection of what you're doing?
Yeah, that is kind of a way to describe my specific research. So I think that's what I enjoy about researching academic interventions, is that we're kind of, we're standing on the shoulders of giants, but we're also kind of reinventing things a little bit on our own. Taking things that have an evidence base, and testing them for, different kinds of learners, testing them in different settings.
Mhm.
That's really the work that I do.
Mhm.
So yeah, that's I think what you would hear from anyone who does academic interventions like I do.
That's really cool. So hopefully you will create a system that will replace the way Common Core math is taught, because that
I wish.
doesn't make any sense to me at all. Again, a whole different discussion there.
Yes.
But, as we wrap up, I want to kind of ask you for any other thoughts, anything that you want to address that maybe we didn't touch on, and then the whole idea of this program is what you believe. And so I want you've said it, I think, several times, but I want you to be able to speak specifically to what you believe about special education, about students, about learning outcomes. So take it away.
Yeah, I think, just going back to what I've said a few times now, it's really, special education is really about improving outcomes for all students.
Mm.
Every child can learn. And as professionals in education, not even just being a special education teacher, but just being in education, that's our mission. And it's on us to act with professionalism and to use our training to help society see that, and help students see that, and their families see that. And it really is just about the child who's sitting in front of you,
Mm.
and really being honest about their strengths and their needs, and just every day kind of chipping away at those goals.
Mm.
I have really been so privileged to work with all the students that I've worked with. I could cry right now talking about them. I've truly loved my students, and it's really been a privilege for me to be in this field, and to work with them.
Mhm. Do you hope that there's a major shift in the way that we talk about learning disabilities and disabilities in general, and the need for special education, to where it's not, they're not the dorks, the dweebs, the to use the vulgar word, the retards, all those things, because again, society can be very cruel. And how do you think we do that? I guess as we close this down, how do we shift that to where we don't look at them as the weirdos?
Yeah, I think yeah, I think they're, as I said, I think at the beginning of this, that's evolving. We have come a really long way. Um, and I, again, really focus on the fact that special education, education in general, but specifically special education, it's another civil rights issue. So, I think the same way that we are now realizing as a nation that we need to be actively anti-racist, anti-homophobic, all those sort of things that, hopefully more and more people in our society are realizing right now. Special ed is part of that. How we treat individuals with disabilities is part of that. I think that's why I kind of fell into special education without really knowing anything about it, is because I know, as being an immigrant and being a woman, civil rights, were things that I had been thinking about since I was in college. And so special education was just kind of, another page in that book for me. So I am hopeful that, as a society, every step that we take forward for one, group or one section of our society, that's going to help us move further along in other areas as well. And I think special ed and students with disabilities are going to be part of that.
And it comes down to seeing people as people, right? Not seeing a black person, a white person, an immigrant, or a native, a person who has a disability, or a person who's normal, or whatever it is. People. And having every person has value. Every person has something in them to contribute. Every person has something that adds to the whole, right? And that, to me, is one of the great defining things about this moment that we're in as a society. I mean, yes, I'm a pastor, I'm a Christian, I have a certain set of beliefs. But at the same time, I am very much of the opinion multiple things can be true at the same time. I can disagree with somebody on the religious side of it, but still agree that person has a right to their opinion. They have a right to their life. They have a right to the same opportunities to learn, to speak, to grow, all of those things. That is all true. Yes?
Absolutely. Yeah.
And that's what you're saying about these kids, that they're still kids. They still have value. They still have worth. They still have the ability to contribute. And if they're given the right opportunities, no, they may not be the rocket scientists or the lawyers, but they will still do something that adds to the whole.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, they are part of our communities. They might be kids right now, but in 5, 10, 15 years, they're going to be, our neighbors. They're going to be people who live in our communities. So really, yeah, having that perspective that they're human beings, and, and that's really what I think, yeah, definitely bringing that humanity aspect to the forefront is really what it's about.
Wonderful. Awesome. Well, I want to thank you again so much for your time, for your insights, for sharing. This has been phenomenal. I've learned a lot, and I hope that everybody who watches this will listen to what you're saying and see not the issues, but the opportunities that go with the person. Thank you again so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. This was so
Wonderful to
exciting.
meet you and talk with
Thank you.
you.
And I hope that you and your family stay healthy and safe.
Thank
Yeah, and thank you.
And I look forward to talking to you once you finish and you are PhD.
Yes, yes.
Bye. And everybody,
Thank
thanks
you so
for
much.
watching. Check us out with our next episode coming very soon. Have a good one. Bye.
You too. Thank you. Take care.